Hello.
Hey,
Hey. Thank you,
can you hear
sir.
me okay?
Sorry
Yeah,
about the
man.
craziness.
No, I'm sorry.
No, no, all's good. Okay, well, we're live. Welcome to
Oh,
Monitoring the Situation.
how are you?
I'm doing great. We're talking a very exciting day. We have OpenAI about to make an announcement. I thought I'd start by just asking to for you to broadly reflect on sort of the OpenAI versus Anthropic. What's happening here? How do you make sense of the ecosystem?
Yeah, so just, obviously disclosure, my wife's at OpenAI. She's one of the first people there, so I have a bit of a bias. Um, I have a bias against Anthropic as well, so I have this kind of like dual bias. Um, but basically just trying to be objective. If you monetized ChatGPT, both enterprise and consumer fully, you'd actually have, I think, quite a lot more revenue than today. So just case in point, my financial software company, we have about 10 licenses to Anthropic, and it's supposed to be $20 a seat. And we get a bill for $1,000, and or like $1,500, and that's it's good, 5 to 7x kind of what we asked for. And OpenAI could do that to their customers too. Their customers will pay it. They don't really care. It's a bargain either way. But if you try to wring every dollar out of your user, that has some adverse consequences, I think. And OpenAI, I think, has figured this out and wants to sort of boost their ASP or whatever dollars per seat. And so they're working their way upstream. But I think the traditional VC, entrepreneur advice would be don't, rinse your customer if you can't help it. And I think that, for Anthropic, for whatever reason, they want to price through the roof with all these overages. I mean, people complain that two prompts eats up their entire allotted, amount. And so I think if OpenAI did that, they probably could get their today's enterprise revenue to something like 100 billion. I know some people would be very surprised to hear that, but I think that's the case. And then on consumer, the same thing with ads, right? So they might have, and again, this sounds preposterous to anybody listening, but if they were steady, if they did the same monetization effort as Anthropic, their real revenue right now would be about 200 versus their 30. So I think this idea that Anthropic's taking the lead or something like that, I mean, it's pretty far fetched. Now, having said that, obviously we're super impressive product, really great people that work there. I think Dario is he's not my favorite guy. Obviously incredible entrepreneur, beautiful business he's made, but the whole like he tried to scare the world by saying AI is going to kill you, it's going to take over the world. Nobody really believed that. It's nonsense. And he says, well, let me shrink that down a little bit to, oh, the AI is going to hack you, and everyone's like, oh, well, it could happen. And so it's kind of the greatest marketing trick, but it's I don't think it's in great faith. And I do think to some extent these guys are true believers of the Doomer hypothesis, and so it's hard to tell what's real and what isn't. It's just conveniently also good marketing.
I was really confused by the Anthropic DOW incident, about a month ago now. Why there was so much support for Anthropic on this? To me, it felt as obvious as like a bullet maker saying, "Hey, we're only going to sell you these bullets, but only if we can, help influence how you use them, separate from U.S. law." Now, I know I'm definitely simplifying it, and I'm sure we'll get some defenders to come on the show at some point. But to me, it kind of felt obvious that they we should sort of leave things to private companies shouldn't be dictating foreign policy. I get their concerns about domestic surveillance, but we have laws for that to protect us from that from government overreach, and it just doesn't seem like the realm of private companies to get into. What am I missing there?
No, I don't think you ever say anything. I mean, I think that the idea that there would be some super governmental, authority is a little scary. I used to, back in the hedge fund days, when the markets were shaky around 2008, I would ask some hedge fund friends, would you rather buy bonds in Johnson and Johnson or bonds in the U.S. government? And it's a very interesting question because in some ways, at the time, it seemed like the U.S. Could default, it could the financial markets could collapse. Johnson and Johnson's not going to collapse. Anywhere in the world where there's consumer healthcare, pharmaceutical, and med tech, they did all three. Every part of healthcare, every country in the world buys Johnson and Johnson. Dollar could go worthless. J&J will survive. United States of America would not, at least financially. Now, obviously, the U.S. is very, you know, is extremely resilient. It's the greatest country on earth, etc. But at the time, there was a question as to whether bond yields would be better for a high quality corporate versus a a sovereign. And certainly, if you look at some sovereigns like Brazil, J&J bonds do yield less than Brazilian bonds. They're riskier. They're more likely to default than J&J. And part of that comes from this, like, again, super governmental. Like J&J, in a sense, is its own country. It has employees. It has couple 100,000 people. It's got a lot of revenue. It's bigger than the country I come from, called Albania. So in a lot of ways, you know, Anthropic in some ways is sort of gonna be its own entity, and this is sort of a nation, sort of network state kind of thinking, corporate state in some ways, and with all that revenue and all that power that comes from having a powerful piece of software, I could see that sort of getting to somebody like Dario's head of thinking about, oh my gosh, with great responsibility comes great power, and it's sort of like obviously way overwrought. Whereas people I think at OpenAI and other companies, even Google, are just sort of like, yeah, it's just software, man. Our job's to sell it. It's not that big of a deal. Meanwhile, he's like, I am Spider-Man.
Yeah.
I must be Batman. He wants to be a superhero, and it's like, obviously he's selling software really well, but
Totally.
I think the theatrics are kind of ridiculous.
Yeah. Us get into other parts of the ecosystem. Are you still a huge NVIDIA bull? I don't know if you saw the Jensen versus Dorkesh, but yeah, what's your latest thinking on NVIDIA?
Yeah, I said that Nvidia would be the first $10 trillion market cap. I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. So I'm starting a sort of a hardware startup. Um, can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Uh, sorry. So I was shorting these stocks, quantum computing stocks, and I had to learn computing. And so I learned a lot about computer science. I learned a lot about hardware, and I was very convinced that the quantum computing story is basically fraud. Like I literally think some of their CEOs of the quantum computing companies will go to jail.
Wow.
It's so bad. Um, Quantum computing is really useful for one algorithm, Shor's algorithm. So unless you're a code breaker, and I don't know any corporate code breakers, there aren't really too many avenues there. So I started thinking about frontier computing in general, and I stumbled upon photonic computing, and now I have a startup in this space. Interestingly, we're already a publicly traded company, but that's sort of your configuration kind of doesn't matter much, whether public, private, or even non-for-profit. So I think photonic computing is really exciting. It's not going to challenge NVIDIA anytime soon, but I think that what I've learned trying to program some AI, a couple pivots ago, before we settled in on financial software, I learned that if you do the flame trace or the Perfetto of the really zoomed in, like nanosecond level instructions, basically all the GPU is doing is matmls, so-called generalized matmul on the NVIDIA hardware, and Light does matmls for free. So you have a matmul machine in Light. God kind of made Light to do matmls whenever it diffracts. So you get the speed of light matmul. And if we had an optical computer, I think it would have like 1,000x to 1,000,000x performance, depending on whether it's speed or speed and energy included. And so flops per watt or something like that, flops per joule. So I think there's like I think eventually, Moore's law, Jensen's already said it's dead. I think everyone's seen that, but you know, I don't think processor speed's going to really improve at all. And I think just shoving more energy through the system, making bigger systems, these are like the only things we can do. We need to do something. I don't want to have data centers in space. I don't want to have nuclear reactors in my backyard. And I think that, it'd be a lot easier if we just made a freaking better computer. And I think that's what's going to happen. So there's Neurophos. They raised 150. There's a company called Flux Computing that renamed to Olix. They raised 250. We're out there. There's a couple of little smaller guys too. And I think that one of us, hopefully all of us in some ways, will, and there's obviously unconventional, which has it's a little opaque exactly what it's doing, but, very highly funded effort. They raised $1 billion, I think. And, I think it's time for a new computer. And ultimately, we're working on the hard parts of this. So that it sounds great, but there's a bunch of catches. And one of the catches is nonlinearity is very hard to do in optical computing. We think we figured out a way to do it. The other catch is there's no memory in optics. So we think we figured out a way to do that. So I think that we're going to see a lot of like bankruptcies. We're going to see a lot of startups in this space. But I think it's sort of time for the end of silicon and the end of maybe not the end of silicon, maybe the end of transistors. And whoever is going to sort of do that. I mean, the number one company in the world is NVIDIA. And so there's $10 trillion, whether you include all the other hardware coming out, the rest of the ecosystem, et cetera. Maybe it's $5 to $10 trillion market cap up for grabs. And it's not an area where there's a lot of startups, which is like really shocking. Like the amount of agent startups is in the thousands and thousands. I can name every single optical computing company on my hand. And compared to biological computing or quantum or some of the other alternative computings, those aren't really that exciting. So Photonic is, many people I've talked to at OpenAI or Meta and other places, they sort of all agree inevitably Photonics is going to be here. And I feel like, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, or even 20 years, it's still worth making that computer because you need to hand the baton off. I don't think NVIDIA is going to stay asleep, but I also don't think that, this is necessarily an easy thing to sort of embark on. Most of the time, these bigger companies will resist kind of uprooting themselves.
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to say you did this epically hilarious debate with somebody on quantum that we'll link to, and he was a bull, and you got into the technology, and he couldn't really, yeah, he couldn't really defend himself there. Although I'm sure he's a nice guy, but
Yeah, very nice guy.
yeah. But it just goes to show that this is very complex stuff, and if
Well,
you're
quantum sounds futuristic, right? It's a
yeah.
quantum that sounds really cool. Like,
Yeah.
well, it's not that cool if you understand that computers basically be measured in sort of two ways. You have the thread number of threads, number of operations at a time, kind of parallelization, which is why NVIDIA is so cool. 16,000 threads versus your average computer's 16 threads, and then it's 1,000x, literally 1,000x more threads, and then you have clock speed, and you have basically multiply the two, and clock speed's in the gigahertz for both of those computers. So you have 1,000x speed up with NVIDIA if you can parallelize the instructions. With quantum, the fastest quantum computer I'm aware of is a megahertz, which is your calculator's faster than that, and it's literally 1,000 times slower than a normal computer. It's single threaded, and the only way the tortoise beats the hare is when you have an algorithmic advantage. And the algorithmic advantage exists, in Shores, but it doesn't exist anywhere else. And what's interesting is you have these market caps at quantum is about in aggregate about 100 billion. And so, obviously Naveen's company, my company, the other couple of companies I mentioned, why don't we have a market cap of aggregate 100 billion? Why not? In fact, because it's actually useful. The world, nobody wants to do integer factorization. Everyone wants to do matmul's. Why don't we have a market cap of 500 billion? And I think we will. And so that's kind of the pitch there. And I know, your company, is I think one of the major investors in this new thing, in Naveen's company, amongst many others, all-star list of investors. And I don't know what they're doing at all, but I understand that the race to make the next computer is on, and some people are sort of half-stepping it. Like there's some great companies doing ASICs, which is fantastic. TPUs even are sort of half steps. You're still in transistors, and you're still limited by kind of the problems that come with scaling transistors, which are well known, and we'll eke out just a little bit more performance out of that. But I think to get 1,000x improvement, you need to do something pretty different.
Is there a particular milestone where you will know you're being successful or onto the right thing, or how are you don't share anything confidential, but how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, I think you have to, we talk about this internally because taping something out is sort of to some extent it's a waste of time. Unlike electronics, you can actually set up these experiments in free space. So that's the nice thing about light is like a light lab, an optics photonics lab is pretty easy to set up. I'd say that unless you get 1,000x or at bare minimum 100x improvement, it's not even worth taping out. Our rivals are using SRAM and some other analog electronics. I think you have to stay in all optics. Never the conversion kills you if you go from electric to optical, back to electric, back to optical. I mean, you might as well not make the chip, in my opinion. But folks want to try it anyway. They want to do their best Grok imitation, and Grok, is obviously great success from an investor standpoint. And so I think you stay in optics. If you can make a whole LLM in optics, then you tape it out, and you hopefully get the performance characteristics we're talking about. But actually, what's interesting about it is, your question kind of is revealing, because what's not well known about this is that guys have been doing this in academics for many years now. So UT Austin showed a optical transformer. Guy at UCLA showed optical nonlinearity. We're very recently. So work has been done on this that's pretty impressive. It's not like biological computing. We're still trying to get like the machine to add two numbers. We don't know how we're going to do it. The soup of neurons might magically start thinking. Um, Optical computing is sort of here. It's just, a matter of scaling it, some of the other challenges I mentioned. So I think if you can get, some of these tricks down, we're actually closer than we think. But I still think, you got to be realistic. No matter how much of an optimism you need as an entrepreneur, you have to be a little bit realistic that you're not going to kill NVIDIA overnight, and you're not even going to kill 5% of it. It's like look at Grok. Grok took this like very small, ultra fast segment of the market. They didn't take it all, but for people that really need like very low latency, Grok's a decent solution, and that's a $20 billion win, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I think you might carve a niche out that optics is really good, say for video, because video and optics kind of they're naturally the same thing. So maybe you do that or something like that, and I think that you'll sort of see it. You'll know it when you see it, and I think that the key is, in my opinion, is investor mismatch. So the problem, if you go to your investors and you say, "I'm going to have something 10x better than Nvidia next year," well, you better deliver that. And if you don't, if it comes out at like 5x or 3x, your investors will probably balk on another round because ultimately, Nvidia is not staying still, and your investors, your employees, everyone around you is just sort of gonna feel despondent that you're not getting anywhere. Google had the power to live through lots of crap with TPUs, right? Like they just didn't work, they didn't scale, and finally they got their breakthrough. It took 15 years. So you need to make sure investors. I've talked to some people recently where I said I might need 20 years. Are you ready to sort of like live that through? For most people the answer is no.
Yeah.
And so we're focused almost exclusively on corporates instead of VCs because I think that, corporates sort of get that, especially corporates that have been through it, they've been around for 40 years. They get that, like, it's worth it to stick around and wait. And look at NVIDIA. If NVIDIA had no revenue, this is a good thought experiment, zero out all the revenue for NVIDIA of gaming and look at the annual financials. What's the net present value of NVIDIA in back in 2020? It's actually the same as the net present value of it with or without gaming GPUs, because ultimately it was worth the wait for that gigantic hockey stick. So if you knew 25 years ago, in 20 years there's going to be a thing called AI, and we're going to dominate the hardware for that, you still should have invested. You still should have made it your no less of your biggest investment than as if they had the revenue and the GPUs. So I think that that this idea of really long termism. I almost want to think about it like a lab, the same, it's kind of the way OpenAI sort of thought about their business was we're gonna monetize something in AI. We don't know what it is, but eventually it'll hit us and we'll know. This is a more directed effort, but I think that there's something powerful about some investors now being willing to wait 10 years or wait 20 years, and the fact there's some entrepreneurs out there like SSI. They're willing to actually tell their investors, you're going to have to be really, really patient with this one. Don't expect cursor here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. To that end, so you're super bullish on NVIDIA. Is there any major, Mag 7 or major tech incumbent or emerging incumbent that you're bearish on going forward?
Ooh, good question. It's so funny because like in pharma you have this dynamic as well where it's sort of very hard to sort of lose your long-term edge. You have to be because these businesses are so valuable that they have a hard time falling apart. I thought you were going to ask me the other question, which is a lot easier to answer.
But you can answer that too.
Yeah, I think Facebook's Meta's the greatest thing ever. I'm just such a big fan of Zuck, and this amazing thing, this distribution he has. It almost doesn't matter if he makes his AI himself. Like all he has to do is like, he could just literally take an open source model, and it doesn't. The problem with AI, I think, is that if you're OpenAI or Anthropic, pushing for more intelligence, like going from 150 IQ to 160 IQ, the kind of kids I went to high school with, it doesn't make them more interesting. You don't want to sit down with those kids at the lunchroom anyway. You mostly Instagram users and Facebook users, most of their questions are sort of normalish stuff. Nobody's asking the Facebook AI prove the Riemann hypothesis. That's something that DeepMind and all these other guys want to do, but who actually needs that? I think that the average person doesn't need questions that complicated, and it'd be cool to see it happen. But for Zuck, I mean, he's got the distribution, and he's got the best product guys in the world, hence the Snapchat battle that he sort of won and stole from. And I think that he's going to continue to do that and win. And I think he's going to get, to a $10 trillion sort of figure or something like that. So I don't know. I feel like, it's so hard to like lose to the Mag 7. I do think we're going to get surprised. Like if you look at the history of capitalism and big stocks, you wouldn't recognize most of the Dow 30 from 100 years ago. United Cigar, there's some companies you've never heard of, and American Can, no joke, we laugh at that now, but like that's going to happen again. Some of these companies, maybe half these companies are going to disappear. And, I certainly think Apple is like one of these things you raise your eyebrow at because, but obviously it's hard to count them out. It's hard to bet against them. But Apple's one, if I had to pick one that I wouldn't like bet on, I wouldn't say I'm ready to bet against it. But Apple seems like it's now old hat, and there's nothing that special or charismatic about the company and their products. They used to be super cool and sleek and edgy. That design, like in fashion, you have to stay fresh. You have to stay pushing the envelope. You stay dangerous. And Apple was dangerous 20 years ago. It was new and nouveau. It's kind of whatever now. And I feel like that's a monopoly that can start to fracture a little bit depending on how other players play. Google is another one where it seems like no matter what they do with Gemini, it just kind of sucks and people don't want to use it. They have the distribution, but they don't have. They just sort of feel like a pocket protector. They feel like Yahoo in 2000. They feel like, it's not cool. It's not interesting. People want to do other things. So we'll have to see, if Google will fail or what will happen. Obviously, TPUs are an exciting business. Search is never going away in some ways, but it feels like there's some changing of the guard. And moments like this is when the Xeroxes become Xerox, and those types of things, those transitions start to happen before your eyes, and you don't necessarily feel it or notice it right away, but they do happen. And I don't know what Mag 7 is going to become a Lag 7, but eventually you're going to get the Lag 7.
Yeah, you could, to your point on Meta. I mean, you could tell they're a live player by them, in the arena, paying billions of dollars for Alexander Wang, for Daniel Gross, for Nat Friedman. Like Apple's not doing that.
Exactly.
They could attract it. They have the money to. They're almost sitting on a resource curse of the iPhone, but not willing to
doing
make
buybacks.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
why do buybacks? Like I if you can't pick the winner, and again, this may sound strange or stupid, but like if it were me, I can't pick the winner. I don't know what company to buy. You can buy 5 or 10% of each of these. Give Sequoia or A16Z, here's $100 billion, go invest it for us. But doing buybacks is like historically it's the worst thing you could do. I mean, it really is kind of this admission that you don't know what you kind of don't know what to do with the capital. You don't know where the future's heading. It's a financial engineering. It's kind of stuff I do. Like it's a very financial engineering kind of nerdy, not that innovative thing, and it kind of like it's indicative of their business, I think, being sort of like they haven't released new products. They're just refreshes the same old products. All the new stuff they did has sort of been bad other than AirPods. So I feel like, it's also going to be other companies. Microsoft's sort of also sitting on a perch that's not great. I mean, they make OS software, don't need OS software anymore. You make Office tools, you can vibe code those, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of like, that's sort of a dangerous perch. I don't think anything's going to happen in Excel, but I feel like there is a fear that all of Mag 7 could be in trouble, and that maybe it is hardware that rules the future.
Yeah, we see Anthropic, OpenAI, threatening startups or even very big companies on a seemingly weekly basis. And Elad Gil, the legendary investor, tweeted out the other day something like, if you're a company in AI, if you're an AI company, consider getting sold in the next 18 months. You're just speaking to the power that these big companies have. And I think there's also just a broader question as to whether the AI sort of platform shift will look like the internet, in that the application companies will accrue a lot of the value, or if it'll look more of like the cloud, in the sense that maybe the hardware layer has the better margins, and like we're seeing with NVIDIA right now.
Yeah, nobody knows, but one thing I think is that software's not dead yet,
Yeah.
and I think that we're making this financial software. We've been working at it 2 years. We're sort of still in beta. We have some nice revenue. We're almost profitable. We haven't launched it yet, and it's this sort of many people try to make this thing. It's sort of a Bloomberg killer. Killer is a strong word. Bloomberg's been this like software monopoly for 40 years. And the reason it works is because it's actually very hard software to make, and your customer expects. I was just sitting down with a customer. he expects the bond prices when he looks up a bond to be right. And bonds are something that like 90% of these apps, like Perplexity Finance, for example, doesn't have bonds. Um, half of Wall Street, or even 60 or 70% of Wall Street's related to bonds. And if you don't have your bond prices in there and you vibe coded it, well, a bond API player takes 6 months to do a contract. Like these guys are so sleepy. They don't want to talk to you. They almost don't want a new customer. And if you want bond prices and you have to like make sure, oh, when you look up this French bond, it's correct. Like that's something that like that kind of taste and that kind of like attention to detail is just not something you can vibe code. And it's so hard to get right. Customers a customer at Citadel, he's not vibe coding something. He wants to buy something. And he wants to buy something that works all the time. And if it breaks, he wants to yell at somebody and take his business somewhere else. That's the kind of thing you get out of software. And the relationships matter. Sal, my wonderful Bloomberg rep or whatever it is, those kinds of things sell software. So I sort of think the panic is most panics aren't, really what you expect. Something's going to change, but I think some of this panic is unrealistic. And then, it again, going back to like, the Bloomberg example, we have like 1,800 news relationships with news companies. And, if you vibe coded it yourself, I've seen people do this, they get 5. And it's like, well, the trader cares about the 1,713th news source that's going to screw up his portfolio. He doesn't care about, the 5 that everyone know about. So I feel like, vibe coding is kind of, it's a fantastic thing, where you can cut your software costs a little bit or just raise the ability of your software, but it doesn't replace marketing and sales. It doesn't replace product and taste. It doesn't replace, personal relationships, and it doesn't replace the customer who wants to have really well-made software. It may increase your ability to compete, but it's I feel like the changes that where like software stocks have dropped like a rock. Those are probably opportunities to buy, and I feel like depending on the stock, you can get some bargains out there.
Yeah, no, that's encouraging. I want to shift to biotech and pharma.
Yeah.
If you were building a pharma company today, I'm curious what you might pursue. That's sort of one range of questions. The other thing I'm curious to get into is sort of, you had this great peptide debate on TVPN, which we loved, and it seems like that's all the rage and only going to be increasingly so. And yet it seems you're bearish on it, and then also just GLP-1s and what that means. So I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, I couldn't have higher conviction. The peptide thing is all bullshit. It's self-diagnosing and self-administering medicine that you don't know anything about. I mean, this is the literally craziest thing ever, right? I mean, you have to be out of your mind. And I understand, like, all right, you're Patrick Collison, you're a super billionaire, you're maybe one of my investors, Naval. You kind of like you want to take health into your own hands. You have a lot of doctors around. Okay, that you're a special case, but you want to impersonate those guys. I think that that's where it sort of ends. I mean, the star asset for these guys is this drug BPC 157. I spent a few days on this thing. I took a few days out of my life, wasted 1% of my year to look at this stupid drug, and it's the worst drug ever. And nobody understands medicine unless you've actually made medicine successfully. I got my first FDA approved drug. It was like 4 or 5 years ago. We got 3 or 4 years ago. It was like accelerated approval. We finally got final approval, which is cool. Accelerated approval is actually contingent. So I got a drug through the FDA. There are not that many. There are about 30 or 40 a year they got through FDA. So it's a pretty hollowed haul. And unless you've done that, you really don't know what it looks like. Drugs are like seemingly simplistic. You look at this Claritin on my desk or something, and you sort of say, oh, I could do this too. And the reality is, it's pretty freaking difficult. In fact, some people say, well, how hard would it be to make this drug or something like that? And I said, imagine the SpaceX, landing, like the chopstick, or the landing up on its head. Drug development makes that look easy. And, because I want you to, in your mind, shrink down the molecule to the molecular, nanomolecular size, where angstroms are your unit of length, 100 nanometer, and imagine the atoms of some kind of organic molecule, and imagine those atoms interacting with proteins atoms, and you're telling me you understand what's going on there. It's really not easy. And I think when I see people do like 10 minutes of pharmacology and they feel like they're experts all of a sudden, no offense to the guy who's debating, Max, who's a very nice guy, sitting down with Max and like teaching him pharmacology over a few hours is like, to me, it's like, dude, you should not be, advocating for this stuff. I mean, it's peptides, for example, are kind of one of the lowest desired drug classes in pharma for the longest time because their half lives are generally in the minutes. And GLPs are frankenpeptides. They take GLPs and they add these fatty acids. They conjugate these different things that make the half life better, and they sort of become biological peptides that are like, they're hybrid drugs basically. Amgen called them peptibodies. So peptides in general are just this terrible asset class for pharma because you need drugs that have long half lives. So BPC7 is not dangerous because it's gone within like 60 seconds. And by the time you inject it, it's dead. And so it doesn't have the time to do anything useful. Any drug guy could tell you that. But I think what this really is about isn't about pharmacology or science. This is about rebellion. I'm a rebel. I get this. It's I don't want to pay Pfizer. I don't want to see my doctor. I don't want to pay insurance. I don't want to get a prescription from sorry. F all that. I'm going to do this myself. And I get it. I mean, it's crazy that maybe it was crazy for me to tell Congress to go F itself, and it's just as crazy to go, make your own medicine. But DIY medicine. I mean, this is the dumbest thing ever. So to me, as a pharma guy, I would focus on and this is where like, I don't want to tear jerk anybody, but like somebody sent me a message today, or last few days, you might have seen on social media about a West Point guy. It's a strong military network. His son just died. He has two more sons or two more kids that have the same disease. They're going to die too. I just had a baby boy. Look, you'd move heaven and earth for anything for your kids. And, how many people in the world know how to develop rare disease drugs? Well, I got one approved. There's maybe 100 guys on planet Earth that can say that, and I'd happily try to develop a drug for this guy. I got banned from the pharma industry for sort of political reasons. I still might want to try and do it in Europe or something or get a special exemption, but there are people dying. There are people dying of hundreds of rare diseases, tons of cancers. Go where the hardest stuff is. Go where the people are suffering the most because that's where ironically, that's where the money is. And for the longest time, these kind of cosmetic diseases actually weren't moneymakers. And GLP's been around 20 years. And then finally, a lot of pharma guys are scratching their heads like, why now? We've had these for a while, and they just finally got mainstream after 18 years of like watching this drug class be kind of like, meh. They finally broke through because they are fantastic drugs. But like, for the longest time, the way you made money in pharma was you went after the most heinous, horrible, terrible illness and made a change, made a difference in somebody's life. And that's how you made money. And I think that's still the case. It's still the case. You have to go after the toughest cancer. The Duchenne muscular dystrophy has been a passion of mine for the longest time. My first company was named after muscular dystrophy. That's, it's a death sentence disease. You could get $1 million a kid if you save their lives.
Wow.
I think Elon's not a drug company, but he's sort of going to do the same thing with Neuralink. I mean, I think Neuralink's going to be a $100 billion plus, maybe even $200 billion company, because those patients, and there's many of them, they want to walk, they want to talk, they want to be productive members of society, and he's making it happen. Yeah. And again, that's $1 million per patient productivity, which insurance is happy to pay. So I feel like the rare diseases, the Alzheimer's, the terrible cancers. This is where you go. I mean, the playbook hasn't changed. I think that, the science is still really hard. I think AI is going to help a lot there, coming up with new ideas. Fundamentally, the drug game is an idea game. You have to sit, toss and turn and say, I wonder if you inhibited, IL-1, would that work for Alzheimer's? Nah, I don't think it crosses the blood-brain barrier. Inflammation's not that important. But what if we did this? And you keep thinking and thinking, and you have these ideas before you even put a drug into an animal or in a petri dish. It's a theory game, and AI can actually do that. It can actually zip through thousands of ideas and come up with something. So I think there's something to work on there, and I feel like, maybe it's Anthropic that does a drug company, maybe it's OpenAI, or maybe it's somebody else. But like, there could and should be a way to make this work. The drug companies themselves don't take to technology very easily or quickly. Yeah. They're probably not the place to do this. but you still have to be a drug company. And I think that's what a lot of the Valley kind of doesn't get. They're like, we want to tackle the pharma industry without being in the pharma industry. And it's like, no, you have to go do trials. You have to go
Yeah.
do the stuff that nobody wants to do, and that makes drugs kind of boring and shitty. And that's why like Vivek and myself were like two big interlopers in pharma, and we're both kind of not loved, for lots of reasons. Because like pharma is this old guy's game. I mean, the
Mm.
average pharma CEO is like 60.
Yeah.
There's no Patrick Collison in pharma, and there never will be. It's
Yeah.
kind of a tough space to be an entrepreneur in. It's pretty ivory tower.
Yeah. Well, you guys were to some degree, so it's you guys. But I hear you on the barriers being there. So just to close the loop on the predictions. So is your thinking that in the next year we'll sort of see that peptides don't really work, or aren't, because a lot of companies are getting funded in this space? You think it's just all going to collapse? And then I'm also curious on the GLP-1 side. Eli Lilly, there's just an Amazon announcement today. It's over $1 trillion. Do you think it's going to be a $5 trillion? Like how big can this get?
Drugs have a big problem. I was a friend of mine talked to Warren Buffett about this. He wanted to sell his drug company. It was privately held. Wanted to sell it to Warren Buffett. Buffett said no, and he said the problem with pharma is IP. So we have to recreate our business every 10 years. Drug goes generic. I have to go find another one. Are you effing kidding me? So like imagine being OpenAI or imagine 10 years after A16Z, actually your patent on venture capital expired. You got to go find a new business. Go do PE or go do lending or something. It's like I was just getting started. I was just hitting my stride. And in pharma, you literally have to go do something else. And so Ozempic's generic in like a year or two.
Wow.
Ozempic's pretty good. And so the problem with drugs is you make a better and better drug and you reach this asymptote where it's like nobody's making a better hypertension drug because we have solved that problem. You can lower blood pressure. You don't need another one. And so once that patent expires, it sort of permanently has lifted the bar for that disease. And eventually GLPs, they're perfect. I mean, you really can't get a better one. So at the end of the day, Ozempic going generic, Mounjaro eventually it's 2040 or something, but eventually going generic. So markets price long-term asset value, long-term cash flows. So Lilly's kind of screwed. They have to find a way to perpetuate, their product. And one of the ways you could do that is manufacturing. But the problem is you sort of have to design a drug that's hard to manufacture if you want to keep it in the long run. And J&J figured out how to do this where for the longest time, small molecules like Claritin go generic very quickly because any Indian company can make it. But antibodies sort of even still haven't, just now are starting to be able to get disintermediated by generics. So like in some ways, like the more complex the molecule, the harder it is to make, the more cash flow you're going to get out of it. Because somebody else may not be able to make it. The patents expire, and they expire quickly in pharma because you have to develop the drug over 10 years. So your 17 to 20-year patent life kind of gets cut in half because of your development timeline. So you have 10, 15 years of cash flow. Lilly has brilliantly staged each GLP to come out one after another in this really smart way. But at some point, the consumers and the insurers say, I don't need super GLP Max Pro Plus. Like good old, generic Ozempic works, and it's $3 instead of super GLP Max Pro Plus, which is $250. Consumers have zero brand identity with these companies, right? Nobody gives a crap that their drugs from Lilly versus Merck versus Pfizer, and they just want the cheap version. And I think that sort of plagues these companies. So I think that's unfortunate. I do think the peptide stuff, it's going to be weird to see this happen because drugs are the reason we have an FDA and it's good is because snake oil sort of works for people. Like people want to think, they want to believe. And so if you think BPC 157 is working for you, you're not going to stop taking it and you love it and you think, oh, well, it works for me. And you might think that, but you have to look at the trials. But nobody can convince somebody, the populace, that statistics matter. It's so hard. Your individual response, even though it's a non-response, it's just random noise around a distribution. You want to believe that it's relevant to you, that it changed something for you. So it's going to be hard to defeat that. I think regulations are the way to defeat it, but we're in this regulatory environment that's really laissez-faire. I feel bad for it because there's actually drug companies. There was a Huntington's drug that was promising, maybe not perfect, and FDA rejected it. And so the Huntington's disease is a deadly disease, horrible genetic disease. Companies spent $200 million making this drug. And the people who are suffering, dying from this disease can't get it, but I can get BPC 157, totally unregulated, stupid medicine that doesn't do anything. I can go inject that. It's sort of tough. I think that's terrible. And I feel like peptides are so safe. That's the one benefit. that maybe people will just trick themselves into doing it. It'll be this weird Veblen good where it's like, oh yeah, I take this, this, and that. That's my stack, and it's like it's not doing anything for you, but you're spending $1,000 a month on it, and you feel better about it, and it gives you some placebo effect. I mean, it's a business. It's not a business I want to be in. Business of pharma is, again, Neuralink, you know, casting it as a pharma company for a second. I'm literally giving $1 million a year productivity to this person. I'm cutting the costs of everyone taking care of them and feeding them and doing all this stuff for them. Now they can work. And the medical system that maybe have been spending $1 million a year per patient on this person and their productivity, you flip that around, and it's an amazing, like, beautiful thing that you will get paid for. To get paid for something, you have to show the value. And if peptide, you can't show the value, yeah, you're going to get some suckers to buy it, but like, that's not really exciting. So I don't know why I'd want to be an entrepreneur in this space when there's, it's easy, I guess. It's like a go to market, go to consumer, direct to consumer kind of thing where you can, finagle your way into, getting some demand. But, this isn't going to scale to, like, the reason Lilly scaled is this product really freaking works, and that's how you win. So I feel like, eh, good luck to it. I mean, I just don't think it's going to be a great place to play.
Yeah. So we did some AI ecosystem analysis, and then we just did some pharma analysis. I want to end on a little bit of an off the wall question, which is hearkening back to your interview with Laura Shin a few years ago. Excellent interview where you analyzed sort of SBF's case and gave him some advice. I'm curious to do a thought experiment, which is imagine SBF gets out early. He gets lucky, there's some sort of pardon, or he just, he gets out on good behavior. Maybe it's unrealistic, but imagine he gets out in the next 5 years, something like that, a shortened sentence, maybe 10 years. What advice might you have for him in terms of, a redemption arc or just reacclimating to society?
Yeah, I mean, I talked to Sam.
Okay.
I like him a lot. I think he should be out. I think the hard part here, and having talked to, like, even the Trump administration about this, is the hard part is Sam has got to show he's a normal guy, and I think he's struggled with that. He's obviously not that normal. In a lot of ways. How many of us go to MIT? How many of us start
Yeah.
a huge company? How many of us pick Anthropic as the first,
Yeah.
bet? So there's something about Sam that people don't trust, and there's something about Sam that, you know, he's got to really let his human side out. And one of the problems here is maybe he doesn't have one. And I don't say that as a bad thing necessarily, but as somebody who understands his path in life, being a prodigy, being pushed on stage as like this intellectual guy, and being shoved into this, like, different room to room math camp, MIT, Jane Street, all this stuff, he maybe didn't have the time to, like, be a normal person. And I think that that's what makes it so awkward and so untrusting. People look at him and they're like, I don't know about this guy. There's something about this guy I don't trust. And he's got to fight hard to make it real, that he's a real dude, and with real life, with real friends, with real emotions, and then people will feel bad for him. But until then, it's like, how do we know this guy doesn't come and, like, pull the wool over our eyes again? And I feel like, you know, truth be told, like, as much as Anthropic was a successful investment, if you look back at that announcement, Anthropic was, those profits seemed like they were going to go in his pocket, and, not in the depositor's pocket, not even in FTX's pocket. So, like, if you look at the round, it was Series A by Sam Bankman, and it was like, well, at the time, that was the tell. That actually is how you would have told, because
Yeah.
where is this 400 million coming from? I mean, most people don't have $400 million.
Right.
Bezos doesn't put $400 million in deals.
No.
Zuck doesn't put.
Right.
The two richest guys in the world don't just drop 400 million on a single deal. The
Right.
biggest VCs, maybe that's still, like, a lot.
Yeah.
So, like, how'd this guy show up with 400 million to drop? And the answer was obvious. He took everyone's money to do it, and that's wrong. And you could almost allow it if, like, hey, it was going to go to all of us depositors somehow. It was going to give us 105 cents on the dollar. Right? Okay, whatever. I didn't ask for this gambling, but if it helps me, I'll take it. And that's kind of my case. That's what I went to jail for. And so, at least I gave the profits to the
Yeah.
people. But I think that it's, no matter how bad, no matter how big of a mistake you made, there's always redemption. It's just, you have to show the vulnerability. You have to say, I fucked up. You have to say, even if you don't say I fucked up, you have to show a scar or wound, or bleed a little bit. And I think that his thing is, like, he wants to fight, but he's not connecting, and connecting is so important. And I feel like his upbringing,
his sort of like MIT math camp, Jane Street life has led him to this position where he's hard to feel sorry for. He's hard to connect to him, and I feel like
Yeah.
if he does get out early, which again I'm advocating for, but it's been met with this very stiff resistance of who really is this guy as a human. That's the question I
Yeah.
get back from the Trump camp. Um, I think that once he does that, not only will people in politics feel bad for him, America will feel bad for him. America will want to give him a second chance because the promise is there. The guy's obviously a genius,
Yeah.
one of the best businessmen ever.
Yeah.
But how do you take that and get the trust, get the
Yeah.
I like this guy, I want to root for this guy. That's what he's got to focus on, and he's brilliant, so I think he might be able to do it. But it's going to take some soul searching, might even take some pain.
Yeah.
He's obviously going through pain right now, but I'd love to see him out. I'd love to see what he could do for society, and I feel like as long as he can be a human, which is some people we joke about them being lizards or robots or whatever, and there's a human in everyone, and I think this experience may actually, this is going to sound really crazy, might actually be the best thing for him,
Wow.
because it's the pain of learning who you are, the pain of going through this pressure chamber that prison is, and forcing you to reflect on like what did I miss, what is this all about, and 5 years in prison, and then coming out and I've heard a rumor that there are investors who have already lined up for Sam's next fight. I'm not kidding. I've heard this from very serious people
Wow.
that, and the numbers are like, they're staggering, that they're willing to drop hundreds of millions or even billions on Sam's next thing. And so obviously, there's something here. And to throw a life away, that like such a unique life away, and I was making fun of Sam, I was digging a little bit. And now, like, that I feel like, he has to go through that journey, that hero's journey of like, he's got to hit rock bottom. And then I think, perhaps, the time will be where he gets out. Maybe it's in this administration, maybe it's the next one. But I see a big glorious comeback if he can find this humanity, find this like, this new person.
Yeah. That's a great note to wrap on. Martin, thanks so much for coming on
Thank you,
Modeling the
Eric.
Situation.
See you soon.
Perfect. Okay.